The United States is in complete and total domination and control over the Strait of Hormuz. We are running the diplomacy. We are in charge of everything. If those darn Iranians don't do exactly what they're told, we're going to smack them again. Or so you would think if you were listening to some of the senior leaders in the United States. But it's not just between the United States and Iran. There's also this other country you may have heard about called Israel, which is trying to throw a bunch of wrenches into the works. Not working out good for us right now, but we can't even get to that part to figure that out until we start to see things as they really are. And there's nobody better to try to figure out what things really are than Anna Kasparian, who is the executive producer and host of the fearless online show, The Young Turks, which goes live weekday at 6 p.m. Eastern. Also, Forbes named Anna as one of their 30 under 30 due to her unfiltered reporting and analysis. She's also a good friend of our show. Anna, welcome back to our show. Glad to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I will say I'm going to turn 40 pretty soon. So that honor by Forbes was a while ago. I don't want anyone to think I'm lying about my age.
Well, then no one would know, quite frankly. Maybe there'll be a new 40 over 40 because I think that that probably would still be your title.
Thank you.
Let's just get right into this because there is just some things are driving me crazy. And I need someone to help calm me down or maybe stir me up more. I don't know. We'll have to see what you're going to do here. But this morning on Fox and Friends, Caroline Leavitt is kind of back in the job now. And she leapt out there to say and repeat something that Vice President Vance had said over the weekend, I think, is that in these tit for tat shots that are going back and forth between the U.S. and Iran, as we're trying to figure out what actually does the MOU mean. She said violence, we met with violence. But then the key part is he said, the president obviously wants to see the peace process play out, and the Iranians would be best to sign a good deal with the United States of America because the president has proven he is unafraid to use the military might that we have. And certainly he did prove that he's unafraid to use it, but there's a difference between being unafraid and using it wisely. How do you see that?
Well, I totally agree with you in that, the strikes that the United States carried out doesn't really accomplish much. And, to be fair, the U.S. sees it as a retaliation against Iran striking a vessel called the Ever Lovely. Now, the way that the media is reporting that story here in the United States would have you believe that Iran attacked that vessel for no reason. It came out of nowhere, but that actually isn't the truth. There is a system put in place in order to ensure safe passage of these vessels. There's a certain path that's been indicated by both Iran and Oman when it comes to these 60 days where there will be transit through the Strait of Hormuz without any tolls. However, in this case, the Ever Lovely was not listening to the orders given by the Iranians and was not going through the path that had been marked as safe for passage of these vessels. And so in an effort, I believe, to show that Iran still has complete control of the Strait of Hormuz, which they clearly do, they decided to strike at that vessel. And the United States retaliated as a result of that. But Iran also made clear that the terms of the MOU have also been violated again and again. And certainly that's true with what's happening in Lebanon. The Israeli aggression and occupation in southern Lebanon has not stopped. In fact, there were some major explosions and bombings that took place in southern Lebanon over the weekend. So Iran is trying to reiterate that, hey, there's an MOU. We agreed on what the MOU includes, yet we are seeing these violations take place. And really what it's highlighting, and this is important for the American people to really understand, it is highlighting the fact that clearly President Donald Trump does not have the control over the IDF's actions, over Israel's actions, as he would like you to believe he does. In fact, Israel has made it clear that they will continue their offensive in Lebanon, and they'll continue violating that MOU because they didn't sign on to that MOU. And so this is what highlights the problem of entering a war against a country of 92 million people alongside Israel, which has very clearly different objectives than the United States.
Well, in fact, in case anybody had missed over the weekend exactly what happened with that, it's actually back to last Friday. There was a separate deal that was struck between Israel, Lebanon, not Hezbollah, but Lebanon, and the United States. Hezbollah was not included. Iran was not included. And let me just ask, and this is Trita Parsi here, who was posted this out and said the fact that Ursula von der Leyen is in agreement tells you all you need to know about why it's a bad deal. But I wonder if you can tell me why you think it's a bad deal, because if Israel and Hezbollah are fighting inside of Lebanon and ending the war in Lebanon is part of our MOU, then what's the point of having a different deal that doesn't include one of the belligerents of the war in Lebanon?
To sabotage what Vice President J.D. Vance is attempting to do in forging peace in the region. So you got to remember, there are two different, at least this is the way it's presented to us. So I'll just take it at face value for now, although I'm a little suspicious of Vice President Vance's, branding as an anti-interventionist. But putting that aside, what's kind of emerging in terms of the two different narratives playing out or warring, if you will, within the Trump administration is you have this hawkish Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who's very much against the path toward peace that Vice President J.D. Vance is attempting to forge. And so while the MOU clearly has Lebanon included in a way that would be far more beneficial to the sovereignty of Lebanon, it would protect Lebanese borders. What Marco Rubio has done is essentially forge a deal between Lebanon and the United States without any involvement from Hezbollah, indicating and formalizing actually the continued occupation of the Israelis in southern Lebanon. It goes against what the MOU has outlined. And so you have two different factions pretty much at war with each other within the Trump administration. And not only does that sabotage the MOU, but it also makes it far more complicated to get to a place of peace in that region, right? Like when we have that war going on with our own government within the Trump administration, it's impossible to believe that there's a real strategy, a real path forward to ending the war against Iran. And to be quite frank with you, and I'm curious what you think about this, I think that the Trump administration is going to continue carrying out strikes against Iran when it's less likely to hurt the markets. And then as soon as we come close to markets opening on Monday, both sides agree to halt tit for tat strikes. So I just feel like there's still a lot of market manipulation going on. And I think that the Trump administration might be bluffing in regard to wanting peace. I think they do want to continue degrading Iran in their minds, even though there really is no military path forward to end this war.
Yeah, I mean, how can you take anything at face value? And let's talk about that for a second. I mean, you see on your screen right there where the foreign ministry spokesman for Iran is saying, Iran says there are no talks scheduled in the coming days, as opposed to what President Trump put out this morning on Truth Social, that there will be one tomorrow. And in fact, that he said Iran begged for it. And now here's Iran saying, we don't even have one scheduled tomorrow. Or even in the coming days. So that's a big issue. But let me ask you this, because this is, to me, this is a much bigger deal than I think is recognized by some. It's one thing to have a battle inside the administration over which side to do. I remember during the Obama time when they were going to have the surge, the big surge that went into Afghanistan. There was a big debate, and there were two big camps in there. They were covered in Jonathan Alt or whatever. So there's all kinds of debate inside. And then once the decision was made, then President Obama went forth and said, all right, this is what we're going to do. I disagreed with that, by the way. I was on the record against it. But that's how it works all the time. You have different camps. That's how it's supposed to work anyway. This one, though, seems different because you have the Secretary of State taking action in this direction and the Vice President taking action in this direction, and silence from the president. What in the hell is going on?
It gives the impression that President Trump is not in charge, that he's not in control. Now, some have this theory that this is just the way President Trump operates, that he likes to kind of pit factions within his administration against each other. But it's one thing to have an internal debate. I think that's actually healthy, and I think it should be robust. However, when you see the Secretary of State take actions that ends up contradicting the very MOU that's supposed to forge a path to peace with Iran.
Well, and I'm sorry, Anna, the one President Trump himself signed. So that's even a bigger deal.
Exactly. You're right about that. And so it confuses people. It honestly, it gives the impression that our government, our federal government, really doesn't have a sound strategy in mind in moving forward with whatever they decide to do. And that's terrifying because what's kind of hanging over this, and Trump knows it because he's referenced it so many times at this point, is the global economy and the fact that we are barreling toward a global depression. And so I don't know when this is going to end. We need to end this. We need to end this now. But it seems like it's very easy to lure Trump back in. And that's where we are right now. And you have to remember, Marco Rubio, based on what we read in the Epstein files and Epstein's leaked emails, was vetted very much so when he was running for the Senate. And so you had Epstein essentially sending around Marco Rubio's resume and his promises to carry out, the Zionist agenda here in the United States. And so he is very much in line with what Israel wants, even at the detriment of the United States, even at the detriment of a possible peace deal between the United States and Israel. So I really do worry about that because the way that he won was by getting the green light from AIPAC, from the Israel lobby, from individuals who want to ensure that we have powerful political figures in charge who carry out the best interests of Israel, essentially.
Yeah, and we're going to see that more on that evidence right now here in just a second. But let's jump to Brother Mike Waltz, because the other big issue in this, trying to get this thing sorted out, is the Strait of Hormuz, getting it open. Who's in control of it? Who's going to be in control of it? Now, there's this issue that Iran is saying that, not Iran is saying, the MOU that President Trump signed says that in paragraph 5 that that Oman and Iran will decide administratively how the strait gets taken care of after the 60 days is over. Our name's not even in there. We don't even get a discussion in there. But Ambassador Waltz went on this weekend to throw a stick in that.
A UN record, 143 nations have agreed with us that this is in violation of international law. Even the Chinese government has said you cannot be taking tolls or fees. Iran was apparently relying on Oman across the waterway to help it set up this new infrastructure. And now Oman has rejected the idea of tolls or fees. So they're completely isolated here. President Trump's not going to stand for it. And meanwhile, we continue to move ships out by the dozens every day. And world oil prices are not just stable, they're dropping. So Iran's attempt to hold the world hostage and their economies hostage are completely failing.
Yeah, but are they completely failing? That was yesterday, Anna. This is today. According to Dropsite News here, the Oman's foreign minister laid out the Sultanate's position on the Strait of Hormuz in an interview published by the foreign ministry, leading weight to the legal framework Iran has proposed. The foreign minister said Oman opposes tolls on transit, which is kind of what Ambassador Waltz said there, which he said are prohibited under international law, but drew a clear distinction between transit fees and maritime environment and other navigational services that may be discussed voluntarily benefiting the state and the companies. And the same distinction Iran has evoked in justifying its service fees. So whether you call it tolls or anything else, it appears pretty clear Iran is very set on charging fees, which is what they've said on our show, which is they said they're publicly. Is Mike Walsh's position going to be clear? This 143 countries going to override what Iran and Oman do?
I don't think it matters what 100+ countries think about Iran and Oman charging a fee, whether you want to call it a toll, an environmental fee, it doesn't matter. There's no military option to gain back control of the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, no one controlled the Strait of Hormuz prior to this war, but we got dragged into this war. But and I just got to say, I don't think any political figure in Trump's administration, or even Biden's administration for that matter, has the right to utter a single word about international law violations by other countries, considering the fact that, beginning with the Biden administration, certainly, our government aided and abetted the absolute dismantling of international law by allowing Israel to carry out a genocide in Gaza. So, I mean, I can't help but roll my eyes anytime I hear any American figure claim that any other country is breaking international law. Now, I would like to maintain and protect international laws, but I don't think that we have seen that same culture, if you will, from members of our own federal government. But putting that aside, fact of the matter is, Iran and Oman control the Strait of Hormuz as we speak, and really they are able to charge, these fees moving forward. Unless there's a way to take control of the Strait of Hormuz militarily, I don't think those 143 countries want to carry out military actions against Iran. I don't think the United States at this moment has the military capacity to, take control of the strait away from Iran and Oman. And so we just have to go along with what Iran wants in this regard. But the Trump administration is having a hard time accepting reality. This is the reality. This is why previous presidents, regardless of how much they were in the pockets of the Israel lobby, didn't carry out this war against Iran. They knew what the ramifications would be. Somehow Trump also knew the ramifications, but went forward with it anyway. At least that's the line that we're hearing from his administration. So actions have consequences. The global community is now suffering the consequences.
Yeah, we actually had Tucker Carlson on the show last week, who explicitly said he was one of those who told President Trump as recently as the 27th of February, the night before the attack. And he, again, with just frustration on his face, said he knew the risk. He knew what the intelligence community, what the military was saying. And inexplicably, he told us that he still doesn't know why he chose to go against it anyway. So, but then the question is going to be, all right, is that same guy's making the decisions right now? And you talked about some of the previous administrations that were definitely friendly to the Israeli side, didn't get in their pocket. But now then, is Trump irrevocably in his pocket? Because I want to take a look at a couple of things that is on the Israeli radar besides just the Lebanon issue and what's going on with Iran. While we're seen to be completely focused on that in the Strait of Hormuz for obvious reasons, the Israelis are focused on other things. And here is, and it's going to be a little hard to read the words on the bottom here, but this is, I think it's Smotrich saying, I think it was yesterday, that they're looking to have 1 million settlers in the West Bank.
זה ההר ששולט גיאוגרפית וטופוגרפית על כל המרחבים האלה. ואם אנחנו לא נהיה שם, חלילה, תהיה שם בסוף חמאס שמשתלט בשנייה אחת, ראינו באיזה מהירות הוא השתלט על עזה. ובסוף כשאנחנו מקימים 103 יישובים ו160 חוות וסוללים כבישים ומתכננים ומסדירים, אנחנו רוצים להביא מיליון מתיישבים ליהודה ושומרון, כדי שלא יהיו טנדרים אחר כך ברעננה, בכפר סבא, בפתח תקווה, בתל אביב, בבאר שבע ובעפולה. וזה נכון, חס וחלילה.
When he says bringing 1 million settlers into Judea, for those who want, that's what Judea and Samaria is what Israel calls the West Bank, what we talk. So they're saying, which is in violation of any UN code, and there are people living there. And so you have to forcibly get them out. That used to be completely against anything the United States believed in. What do we believe in now?
I mean, clearly, the Trump administration believes in allowing Israel to do pretty much anything and everything they want. And there are no restrictions at this point. I mean, I thought there were no restrictions under the Biden administration, but the Trump administration has kind of taken that treatment of Israeli aggression and put it on steroids, essentially greenlighting anything and everything Israel wants. And, the thing that I'm having a really difficult time understanding is how there are still people here in the United States defending Israel when they have carried out their aggression in now multiple countries in that region. They're doing that right now as we speak, whether we're talking about Lebanon, Iran, the West Bank, Gaza, Syria is another example. And they're out of control. The reason why they are out of control is because our government is aiding and abetting it. Our government is providing the military weaponry and assistance to carry all of this out. And in fact, the Cradle had a report just today showing that some of these absolutely unhinged, violent Israeli settlers have been given drones by the Israeli government to carry out exactly what we just heard Smotrich say. And so I am worried about all of the innocent, civilians who will get killed. And of course, Smotrich, just like any other Israeli politician, will point to boogeymen, oftentimes completely made up, in this case, claiming that Hamas is going to infiltrate the West Bank. And it's such a threat. And so since it's such a threat, we're going to flood the West Bank with 1 million Israeli settlers. It's just, they always use the same excuse, and never mind the fact that whenever it's convenient for them and whenever they can see it as a long-term part of their project, Israel has no problem supplying weaponry and aiding and abetting terrorists themselves. They certainly did that in Syria. They had no problem doing that in Syria, in fact. They had no problem arming ISIS-linked militias within Gaza in order to terrorize the Palestinian people. And so they create terrorism, and then they get to point to said terrorism as their excuse for attempting to take more and more land from sovereign countries and from Palestinian territory.
Well, yeah, because it's like you said, then there's the only way. It's not even that we allow them to, it's that we enable it. Without our ammunition, weapons, all this other kind of supply, diplomatic blocking, they can't do those kind of things. So the words speak much, or the actions speak much louder than the words. Last thing I want to talk about here, which is something hardly gets any notice at all. In fact, I hadn't seen any major headlines in this, but it's something that kind of got my attention here, and I have a problem with it. You can tell me what your thoughts are. This is Benjamin Netanyahu. I think it was yesterday. Maybe it was I didn't get the date on this one. He says, today we unanimously, I think it was yesterday, unanimously approved that the government a strategic move for the future of the Jewish people, a national plan to strengthen Jewish education in the diaspora. Okay, so diaspora, that means all the countries outside of Israel. But then when you look at the details here today, approximately 1.8 million Jewish children of school age live in the United States, but only a small portion of them study Jewish educational institutions. We view the expansion of Jewish education as a strategic goal of the utmost importance, especially in light of the rising anti-Semitism, et cetera. And they have spent 200 million Israeli shekels, which is about 60 million US dollars. The only thing, there's 193 countries in the United Nations, and only one of them for the diaspora is going to get this money to teach people inside of Israel inside of the United States about Israel. Now, on the one hand, you can say, okay, well, they're Jews, they can learn from that. But the fact that they are spending money in our country to teach a version of what they think that's their advantage, not our advantage, that seems to be a problem. What would happen, Anna? Let me just ask, what if this was the government of Saudi Arabia? What if they we're going to spend $60 million to teach our kids about things that are important to our country, not America? Would we be okay with it?
I wouldn't be okay with any foreign country doing this. I mean, my heritage is Armenian,
Agreed.
even though I'm born and raised in America, and very much see myself as an American. But I would have a problem with the country of Armenia doing this. This is ridiculous. But we know what the real game plan here is. And I just don't think it's going to work. You know, I think that Israel's Hasbara has been historically very effective here in the United States. But what Netanyahu has trouble accepting is that his own conduct has woken many Americans up about what's really going on here. And so it doesn't matter how much money the Israeli government spends on propaganda here in the United States. And that's what this really is. I have no problem with Jewish Americans learning about their Jewish heritage. I think that's a wonderful thing. When it's coming from the Israeli government, there's clearly an effort to propagandize Americans on our own soil. And that is a big problem. And
right. And I 100% agree with you, by the way.
Yeah, there should be a stop to it. But here's the thing, there won't be. I would be surprised if there are any protests. And what's also really obvious to me about the Israeli government's tactics here is they seem to be flooding the zone with so many different things that the American people are going to have a hard time fighting against. You know, you have Senator Tom Cotton attempting to pass a provision in the National Defense Authorization Act that forces our intelligence community to share all our intelligence with the Mossad. You also have that provision in the National Defense Authorization Act that merges the IDF with the U.S. military, which, you know, I had some paranoid thoughts just yesterday about, well, what if Israel wants to use our own military against the American people if the American people, you know, increasingly have problems with the alliance that we have with Israel? Like, there are all sorts of concerns that Americans have right now about this relationship, but it's going to be hard to tackle everything because the zone is being flooded with all sorts of provisions and all sorts of efforts by the Israeli government to take more and more control of our country and our government. So I am worried about that.
And do you think that do you have any concerns that there is a growing, and I was talking to some young people just this past weekend, I was looking at some polls that I think it's like under 35 crowd is like overwhelmingly opposed to the civilian leadership in Israel and don't like their policies and feel like it is intrusive into our country here. But then you look at the boomers and the people who have the money, and the dial hasn't moved much, in that, and they still have the money. I fear that there could be a friction growing within the United States if the people start getting in higher numbers against that outcome, but the other people with the money and the positions in Congress still keep going down the other path. Who would win that battle if it comes head to head? Would the politicians be firm and keep going down a path that's pro another country? Or do you think that they might finally start listening to a growing tide of American voters?
The politicians should actually look out for themselves and do the right thing and listen to the American people. Ignoring Americans and what they are demanding is, I already see the beginnings of some violence breaking out. You know, if people feel that their system of government is not representing them, if Americans feel betrayed, they're going to turn to other means to be heard, to get what they feel is the correct policies for them, okay, and for our country. And so I'll give you one quick example. You know, there is a local lawmaker in California. His name is Scott Wiener. I believe he's in the California Assembly, but right now he is running to fill Nancy Pelosi's seat in the House of Representatives. Now, he was slow to condemn Israel's genocide in Gaza. He was slow to call it a genocide. But I do believe for political reasons, he did change course and is on the right side for whatever that, you know, means to anybody. But he is now being met with some pretty angry crowds of people as he goes to campaign events, as he, you know, he went to an, I believe it was like a trans pride event in California. So you would think, and he's a gay politician as well. So you would think like he'd be welcomed, he'd be loved there, but no, he was run out of the event. And then later at a different event, same thing happens. And he's being shouted at to the point of tears. And I'm worried. I am worried because that's the Democratic side. We're talking about the Democratic side. I know that when Republican voters feel that their government is treading on them, collecting their tax money, but not representing them, they fight back. And so I don't know what form that fight is going to come in, but if this is a prolonged situation where it is abundantly clear to the American people that our government is not representing us, people will take action. And I'm worried about what that action is going to look like. Yeah. We need a government that listens to us. And we unfortunately don't have that right now.
We do. And okay, we got 3 minutes left here. I'm going to give you a complete separate topic here. Just kind of want to see where you land. I didn't look to see where you are in this, so I have no idea what you're going to say. But where do you come down on this new thing by President Trump to change the definition of like the Mamdani folks and the social, what are they? Democratic socialists, sorry. Now that they're communist and they have to be feared, how do you view that whole recharacterization? And to me, it's like it's a real problem that he's demonizing this whole group and pitting one side of Americans against another, not just for policies, but just as a category. How do you view that?
I view that as more of what this country has been undergoing for many decades now, which is a very intentional effort to get ordinary Americans to focus on fighting each other, focus on being afraid of each other. And by the way, I fell for this on the Democratic side, where I was absolutely convinced that Trump voters were dangerous, you know, that they want fascism. This was during Trump's first term. But little by little, it became very clear to me that the powers that be, right, on both sides of the political aisle seem to have a vested interest in getting Americans to fear each other, to fight each other, as the corruption becomes more and more of an issue, as wealth disparity continues to grow in this country and more Americans are kicked out of the middle class and are struggling to pay their bills to put food on the table. I would just ask, you know, your audience, and I ask my audience every day, to not take that bait. Now, New York, especially Manhattan, I mean, we're talking about a pretty unique place in the country, and they are further to the left compared to the rest of the country. And so the outcome of those races didn't surprise me very much. I don't think that you'd have the same race in a more moderate or purple district. So don't buy into the fear mongering. I don't think that there are crazy communists that are going to overthrow our system of government. If anything, they could serve as a moderating force within the United States Congress.
Yeah, because the bottom line, this is not the commies of the Red Army back in the 1950s. Joseph McCarthy seems to have made a comeback, but let's hope he's putting back in the grave. So that doesn't help anybody. I'd love to go down that with you more, but unfortunately I'm out of time for right now. But thank you so much for coming on, Anna. And just a reminder, you can see more of Anna at the Young Turks, tyt.com, which we do the same here. So thanks so much for coming on. Look forward to having you back again real soon.
Thank you so much for having me.